The most valuable work is usually the most boring work. My name is Fari, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through how, if it's boring, it's probably valuable. How I'm thinking about this and how I'm implementing this inside Killer Chaos OS, which is our own internal operating system that governs how we're able to build backend systems. So, everyone talks about bold visions and bold moves, making all those bold moves, but few rarely talk about the boring reps that actively makes them real. And what I mean by this is that the truth of most of the things that compound into compounding leverage is ultimately what is not glamorous. The things that most people wouldn't do are ultimately what I believe is ultimately where the leverage most lies. And that means that it's in the back end work. What I mean by this is it's the late night fixing edge cases that no one sees, but it's the hours refining a workflow as well that never gets likes. For example, the documentation that no one ever reads, for example, like these daily videos. I don't get so many views, but that's not ultimately where the leverage lies in the long term. I know that into the future, what we're building is only going to compound, and that is where I believe that it is most valuable because with the videos that we're ultimately making and also the systems that we're able to build, I know that we need to make sure that we're just focusing on the things that are quote unquote boring because that's where I believe the most leverage and value lies. It lies in the things that not many people do see, but it's what all makes the difference in the bigger picture. You may not see it each and every single day, but saying, hey, if we look at backend systems, we look at the systems that ultimately run businesses. Say if we have a analytics dashboard where we're able to track churn rates, we're able to track the data metrics in terms of how many people are signing on, how much cash flow is coming from that, and also LTV as well. If we're ultimately able to have these dashboards and specific means to ultimately be able to track this in the present moment in time and also into the future, that is ultimately boring. No one ever wants to connect different datas and ultimately centralize it into one consolidated place where you're ultimately able to see how the business is running. And this is just one of the things that I believe is what is most valuable, simply because it's boring. I mean, no one ever wants to be the guy that builds the back end network that ultimately allows businesses to run leaner and ultimately scale a lot more efficiently. And I think this is where the leverage lies, especially in my experience, because one of the most important things when I was first starting out was I thought that I had this big picture vision of saying, hey, I ultimately need to focus on what prints, what ultimately is flashy. And I realized that as I've got more skin in the game and as I'm getting more skin in the game, I realized that owning the infrastructure layer is the most boring work, but ultimately it's where the leverage lies, and it's also super valuable. So now each and every single day I ultimately just ask myself why, because asking why 5 times, specifically why a business runs a certain way, ultimately allows me to get to the hidden core, which is the infrastructure layer that is ultimately hidden from the surface level. And understanding this hidden infrastructure layer, ultimately I know that that is where the leverage lies. For example, I go to the shopping mall and I ask, hey, we've made this purchase, we've bought all these groceries and things of that nature, but ultimately what actively runs this? How do QR codes get scanned? How do they then take these QR codes and the packaging and the logistics of it? How does it actively work? And then by seeing that and asking those questions, you then see a bigger picture where you see these different networks where logistics runs, where you basically see all the people that are planning the logistics, getting from suppliers, getting from different farms, and basically sourcing that out as well. Then you see this entire big picture vision that you don't see when you're just buying a loaf of bread or just buying milk as well. You ultimately then ask so many questions to the point where you understand that there is a hidden back end engine that ultimately runs how you're able to purchase goods. And ultimately through this, I like to use the same concept through understanding how businesses run, to say, hey, we may interact with Apple, but ultimately what runs Apple? You see an entire network of logistics partners, people that basically are able to assemble the iPhone or the MacBook. You see so many different key role players that ultimately come together to build this one product. And that is where all the leverage truly lies, in my opinion, to to ultimately understand that, hey, there's a much deeper layer, and how do we understand this layer on a deeper level that ultimately allows us to then say, hey, how can we actively build for this specific layer? And this is one of those things that aren't, simply seen, and I want to be able to change that into the future. Hint hint, it's something that is coming up, announcement in a couple days. And for solely understanding that each and every single day, we need to basically, make sure that we're striving to understand things at a much deeper level, because if we're able to understand things at a much deeper level, we can do the boring work that is the most valuable work that we can possibly do. Because through this, we are ultimately then gonna have the main goal of ultimately saving the entire system. And how I'm actively thinking about this is ultimately in three parts, where leverage lies in the boring, like I mentioned, that every optimized process creates invisible compounding efforts that ultimately stack over time. What this basically means is that every specific workflow that we're building, we need to be able to optimize it and make sure that we're reducing, we're deleting, because ultimately understanding from first principles, why is this process actively the way that it is? Can we delete specific parts of it, and what are the requirements, and who made the requirements? And if this is basically first principles thinking, one-on-one, which I am a big proponent of, especially building systems and building processes and workflows. I think there's a lot of places that could possibly optimize, especially if you're coming into a business. You can ultimately delete maybe 10, 20, or even more percent of the current workflow and still run as efficiently, so that you're not as bulky. And I know that this ultimately compounds over time, because then we can just add things back, say 10%, like first principle says, that we're ultimately building that compounding leverage that ultimately stacks over time. And understanding that the boring is defensible. What I mean by this is that everyone can get hyped by the idea, but few stick around to refine it 1,000 times. And that is where the moats are actively built. For example, anyone can have the idea of saying, hey, I'm ultimately gonna shoot 100 videos in 100 days, but ultimately understanding that it takes a lot more, refinements and processes that ultimately go into making these daily videos, that ultimately, gets rid, or filters out, if you will, the people that aren't as serious. Because sure, 100% ideas are good, they're great, but ultimately I think execution is where the most leverage lies, and that lies in doing the boring stuff over and over and over, and understanding that this is where the moat is built. This is where the compounding moat, in terms of our efforts that we make on a day-to-day basis. I could make these videos each and every single day. I could say, hey, I want to make 100 videos in 100 days. That sounds good, in terms of the idea, but ultimately building the moat that ultimately compounds, in terms of understanding how to basically storytell and also share what it is that I'm building on a day-to-day basis. That is a whole different ball game that comes from rapid iteration, basically iterating over 1,000 times, 100 times, for example, in this case, all over and over and over, so that we're ultimately able to get to the big picture vision where we are much better than we were when we first started out. And also understanding that boring creates speed. This is ultimately counterintuitive, but it is true. Understanding that when your systems are airtight, you are able to creatively flow faster because you're not patching leaks. If you're ultimately, just patching leaks each and every single time, that ultimately means that you're losing a lot of time and speed as well. Because I think, and I believe in business, speed is everything, and also in life. Speed is one of those things that you ultimately need to have, because it can also become, your compounding leverage. For example, for me, I like to keep my message response time, 5 minutes at most minimum, and ultimately, just make sure that I'm, having that speed mode, and making sure that I'm also incorporating speed in every single facet in my life. Just making sure that, hey, if someone sends me a message 30 seconds later, I'm going to respond. I'm going to always just be on the ball, and making sure that we're ultimately able to, build that speed mode, because speed is, ultimately comes as a, leverage point especially if you're building something. When someone says, hey, this is going to take 2 months to build, and then we say, hey, we're going to get it done in 3 weeks. Ultimately, obviously, that is going to, ultimately scale through time as you ultimately being able to patch these leaks. But that comes from just repetition as well. So it's also the second part where you do it over and over again, that you build these airtight systems within your OS, which is your basic operation or operating system, like I normally say, which basically logs the decisions that you make and ultimately helps you solve problems as well. And then ultimately, for me, I like to use three quote unquote three boring systemized thinking tools, which number one is version everything. Every system, every doc, every workflow gets logged, basically being able to document and making sure that no dead ends. There's always a blueprint in every single thing that you do, basically understanding how we came to the decision that we came to, and also making sure that we're just documenting the entire process, so that when we get a new team member or someone else comes on board into the future, they understand how we've been able to build. Even if we made mistakes, they're ultimately able to learn from those mistakes, so that if they have any questions, they can simply just refer to the doc, and that ultimately becomes a source of truth, not only for me but also for the team, so that we're ultimately actively able to move forward in every single facet in terms of our builds, and also just increasing speed as well, and understanding that we need to make sure we're automating the repetitive. So if I do something more than twice, I ask myself, why isn't this automated yet? But I do understand there is a point where automation becomes too much, and then you ultimately have to delete. That is a specific instance that ultimately requires a whole new different topic that I can create another video on. But ultimately understanding that if I ask myself, hey, why are we doing this? Why does this actively need to be done in this specific way? That ultimately allows us to get closer to the source of truth. That ultimately allows us to refine our processes. Some things you may think that they may need to be automated, but they ultimately actively don't. If you ask the question why 5 times, you ultimately see, hey, is this actively a scalable solution that is ultimately going to help us into the future? And then ultimately understanding this, I think, is super key for us, especially now and going on into the future. And then ultimately being able to design feedback loops. I think this is one of the most important modes. Like I spoke about a couple videos way back about the strategic advisory board, that you ultimately design these feedback loops and the chaos feedback cycle as well, that you ultimately are able to build these airtight feedback loops, such that if the system tells me when it breaks, then instead of me chasing errors, so that the system is ultimately able to tell me when it breaks, and then instead of me actively standing at the forefront and saying, hey, what are the errors, let's just check all the errors, because that is ultimately mental bandwidth that is lost, and also time that is lost that we can never possibly get back. But we ultimately need to make sure that we're having this airtight the thinking tools in terms of how we're systemizing our mental OS, because that is ultimately going to scale our efforts through time, especially the way that we're building Killer Chaos OS. And now this is the mindset that ultimately is behind building Killer Chaos OS, not chasing the flashy, but rather focusing on the boring, and making sure that the boring is so sharp, so precise, and so inevitable that the vision has no choice but to become a reality. And I know that into the future, like I always do mention in every single video, that we're gonna make mistakes, we're gonna ultimately get some things wrong, but the things that we do get right, we're gonna make sure that we hit the nail in the wall, and just make sure that we're doubling down on that, because the flashy parts will come, but ultimately the compounding ROI is ultimately hidden in the boring. And I think this is one of the most important modes, to ultimately understand that the work that we're doing, if it's boring, it's ultimately valuable. Most of the times that I found where my most leverage lied was ultimately in things that were ultimately quote unquote boring, but ultimately this on understanding this ultimately led me to understanding that the quote unquote boring things ultimately compound, and they ultimately create leverage for our clients and also for us. And how can we actively think about these tools in specific instances and specific use cases? We need to make sure that we're constantly just refining the machine and scaling the machine into the future as well. And I know, like I always say, we're going to get some things wrong, but we're ultimately going to get some things right as well, that we're ultimately going to take as a source of truth, and ultimately run with. And if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to connect with me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram. We are on day 97, 98 if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, we're almost on day 100. Special announcement on day 100, and then from there we're gonna take things up a notch, and I will make sure to let you guys know. So it's me. If you want to connect with me, like I said, X, LinkedIn, Instagram, and I'll see you guys in the next video.